Welcome, everyone, to Succeed Together's Global Voices Literary Festival. We have a fantastic lineup over the next 2 days, and you can still sign up for our free and ticketed events. The link to register is in the chat. My name is Marcia Marley. I'm the president and ED of Succeed Together, the parent organization of the Montclair Literary Festival. All proceeds from our ticketed events this evening and tomorrow benefit Succeed Together's mission of leveling the playing field so all children and families can access the educational resources that only a few can afford. These services are especially needed now during the pandemic. I want to start the festival by thanking you all for helping to make this year's festival such a success. Because of your support during this difficult year, we have been able to maintain and expand all of S2G's programs, including the Literary Festival. This would not have been possible without such talented staff. I want to acknowledge the amazing job of our festival director, Jackie Moss, and Deputy Director, Katrina Browning. Bravo. Thank you both for your hard work. It is my pleasure to introduce the amazing and talented Irish writer, Kevin Barry. Kevin is the author of novels Night Boat to Tangier, Beetlebone, and City of Bohan, I think it is. The story collections Dark Lies, The Island, and There Are Little Kingdoms, and of course, the one we're discussing today, That Old Country Music. His awards include the Impact Dublin Literary Award, the Goldsmiths Prize, the Sunday Times EFG Short Story Prize, and the Lannan Foundation Literary Award. His stories and essays appear in the New Yorker, Granta, and elsewhere. His 2019 novel, Night Boat to Tangier, was longlisted for the 2019 Booker Prize. He also works as a playwright and screenwriter and lives in Ireland. Our moderator, Matthew Thomas, is the author of the New York Times best-selling novel, We Are Not Ourselves. According to one review, it is the best Alzheimer's novel ever written. It was shortlisted for many awards, the James Tate Black Prize, the Center for Fiction First Novel Prize, and the John Garden Fiction Book Award. Long listed for the International Dublin Literary Award, the Guardian First Book Award, among others. He teaches at Xavier High School in Manhattan, as well as NYU's Low Residency MFA program in Paris. Matt lives in Montclair and is working on his second novel. All our authors appear here for free. And the best way of supporting them is by buying their books. You can see the little green tab below your screen. You can support local businesses by buying from festival partner Watch On Bookstores. Just click on that link. Kevin and Matt, we are thrilled to welcome you to our Global Voices Festival. Thanks for coming.
Thank you. Thank you for having us. Kevin, thank you so much for being here with us.
Thanks, Matt, and thanks so much to Marcia and everybody at Montclair for inviting me over this afternoon.
Kevin, I've been so looking forward to chatting with you about this book. There are so many different things that I'd love to talk about, but let me just say I want to maybe structure some of the conversation around two levels. One, the book as a whole, and then individual stories. I'd like to sort of make some connections among the various stories and look at it as a book, and then dive a little deeper into some of the individual ones.
Sure.
One of the first things that occurs to me when I think about the first story is something that in some ways touches on a lot of the other stories in a very oblique way, and that is that you write so movingly about love. Love seems to be one of the hardest things to write about, because love is a species of happiness, right? And we learn so much from that first line of Tolstoy's great Anna Karenina, right? Happy families are all alike. Every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. Writers have always been given fits when they try to write about love, and you do it so beautifully in this story. And I wanted to ask you if you think that it works so well in part because they face difficulties sort of toward the last third or about halfway through. Is that why the story of this love in this first story, this beautiful, The Coast of Leitrim, why the love story works so well?
Maybe, yeah. The other quote that comes to mind for me about writing about love, when you're writing about love, you're also writing about happiness, of course. And I think Iris Murdoch said, "Happiness writes white." It's very hard to see it on the page. It's very hard to make it show up and live on the page. I would say it's fair to say that love doesn't run a smooth course generally in my work and in my stories as in life. It was interesting as I wrote this first story, The Coast of Leitrim, which is a love story. I could sense the way that I've changed as a writer over the last 8 or 9 or 10 years. It's like 9 years since my last collection. It came out in 2012 on this side. And as I was writing this story, I was thinking it was going in a particular direction, a kind of a dark direction. I was thinking this one is going in with blood on the walls.
Yeah.
You know, there's just no other way for it.
Yeah.
And I think if I'd written it as a younger man, it probably would have gone in that sort of grand guignol sort of direction. But here, the wonderful thing sometimes with the story is it utterly surprises you and takes a life of its own and goes in a different direction. And it started to pull away from that type of bloody ending I'd expected. I went to a kind of a much more mellow place without giving too much away.
I absolutely agree, and I think one does wonder if that's the direction it's going in while reading it. And I just found myself so delighted that it took the turn it took, because it's actually really hard to find happy endings in literature, right? It's one of the hard things to find, right? What do you
I've been writing short stories in a kind of in a serious way, in a kind of dedicated way since my late 20s, so more than 20 years now. And I think this is my first thing even resembling a happy ending, you know. And it was as much a surprise to me as I'm sure as it would be to my readers. We're not certain it is a happy ending.
Right.
There's a little barbed line in kind of the second last page, where we're told that Seamus, the romantic lead in the story, we're told he can handle anything except a happy outcome. So we don't know quite in a very Irish way what he's going to do with this potential reward of happiness, of love that comes towards the end of the story, if he'd be able to deal with it. But I like to think that maybe he will. I'm trying to think about like great short stories that have happy endings, and it's a rare enough beast, you know.
It is. I mean, maybe the lady with the little dog ends in a kind of happiness because they found resolution together, even if it's dark.
Yeah.
But the happiness in this story is very earned. I feel like you earn every bit of it. It doesn't feel in any way cheap. It feels like it rings the right bell. And I just wondered how you felt you allowed yourself to sort of release, I think, perhaps some of the earlier work and get to this ending at this comfortable place that you're in the great maturity of your writing at this point. And how did you find that happening?
I guess I find a story, and with every story I write, I kind of find it in the first instance at the level of the sentence. I listen along, sentence by sentence, and almost, and it sounds a bit weird and esoteric, but almost try and let the sound and the rhythm of the sentences tell me what's gonna happen next, as if it's a song, as if it's a kind of a music. I do think prose fiction is a kind of a musical form. One of the lesser musical forms in some ways. We writers aspire to be musicians, I think, in some ways. You know, that's what would be fine if we could play piano or sing songs. We wouldn't have to write our stories. But I think, for me, it's short story writing is weird. It's almost like the longer you're at it and the more you do it, the less you know about it, and the more difficult it becomes. You can never figure out why one story works and why most of your stories, you know, don't work. It's a curious kind of impalpable beast. There is something magical about timing in a short story that solves the story for you often. If you get the timing of a story right, and if you get the kind of little accelerations between places and time right in the story, it can work. But it's very hard to see why one story will work. And most stories start off great. You know, you start in this kind of fit of enthusiasm. And the first page or two is great. And most stories in dip and you don't get there. So it's a really frustrating form. But I kind of really I respond to the difficulty of it. Because it's rare, you know, that one of your stories works out for you and surprises you and delights you.
Well, those listening in, every story in this book works. It's such a beautiful collection, individually and as a cohesive whole. And Kevin's point about the prose, musicality of prose, the possibility of musicality of prose, is utterly realized in this book. The sentences are so beautiful. In fact, I wanted you to read from the first story, if you don't mind, and perhaps a way of giving the audience a little sense of how things are. And if you don't mind, on page 15, there's this wonderful description of the cooking of a meal that I found so sensory and so evocative. And it goes right into, from there, a beautiful description of his allowing himself, perhaps reluctantly, to fall into love with this woman. Would you mind reading, just starting at no doubt it was national stereotyping on the top?
Sure. And where will I go down to?
Maybe just... If you wouldn't mind, go to on the next page. If we're going to be brutally fucking honest about things,
okay,
that's a good line to stop at.
Okay, so Seamus and this Polish woman Catherine have just had their first date, and it took a long time to get to the first date. So now we're at the point where they've gone back to his cottage on the mountain. No doubt it was national stereotyping to think so, but she seemed to know her way around a head of cabbage. From his spice rack's broad selection, she took some caraway seeds and softened them in hot, foaming butter, and stir-fried shreds of the cabbage in the fat, and these were delicious with thick slices of bacon and the sourdough bread he had brought from the market. They ate in silence, as the sun broke through the heat, the last of the day, and its warm light was lavish in the room. They kissed for a long while on the sofa, and then went to bed, and even that worked out well enough. He felt himself falling. In the native way, he was tormented now by his own happiness. He could not imagine a future day without Catherine. That would be hell. To be able to stand back from and recognize his obsession as exactly that did not lessen its extent nor remove its danger. He waited for her outside the cafe each day. He kept step with her across the bridge to the Cortober side, and together they slowed to look out over the water. Tears welled up in his eyes, and he had to make out it was the breeze off the river was the cause of them. "What is it?" she said. "Really?" "I didn't realize I was so on my own," he said. "If we're going to be brutally fucking honest about things."
So wonderful. I think probably those in attendance can hear in what I had Kevin read the gorgeousness of the sensory writing, and that's so characteristic of his prose. There's such a patience in the rendering, such beautiful portraiture all throughout, and each sentence does feel as if it's made as a separate entity, and yet they don't stand alone in a sort of marmoreal way. There's something lovely about the interconnection of your sentences. Can I ask you, in this story, there's the hint of the supernatural in this. It's just the slightest hint where he begins to feel as if he has a kind of connection to her through telepathic contact. And in a couple of other stories, something on the order of that comes up. Later in the book, in the story Who's Dead, McCarthy, we have a character who essentially becomes possessed by the preoccupation that a character that we've been following all along was possessed by. So there's a kind of there's a slight hint of the supernatural in a sort of metempsychotic transfer of consciousness at the end of the story. And it really struck me as not unlike that telepathic connection in the coast of Leitrim. And there's one other instance like that on 159 in Extremadura, where the dog is speaking to her. And there's the reason I bring it up is because I wondered if you were sort of consciously playing with, since this is such an Irish book, ideas about a kind of, I don't know, a kind of Celtic, a notion of not magic necessarily, because that's a ridiculous idea. But does this strike you as a theme that was sort of on your mind?
Yeah, it's interesting. I would never go to my desk with the idea of doing some Irish writing,
Right.
Right. But as you suggest, I am very much an Irish writer. I can't help it. It comes out, and one of the things about us is that we're not irrational people. It's in some ways it's quite a thin layer of civilization that we have thrown over us. If I look beyond my computer out the window opposite, there's a lake, Loch Arrow in County Sligo. But in the fields running down to the lake, the only trees standing in the fields are whitethorn trees. And they're there because farmers won't cut them down, because there's a lot of sort of mythology and sort of superstition attached to them. And it's what folklorists call half belief. This is very common in Ireland. It's not that those farmers would necessarily think there are fairies dancing beneath the trees in the pale moonlight, but they're not going to risk it. Just in case, and that kind of irrationality is a theme in Irish life, and a kind of a belief, I guess, that what we can perceive and see and hear and feel with our senses isn't all that's there. It's not the full picture. One of my kind of fundamental beliefs always as a writer is about feeling, is about human feeling, and my belief that it doesn't really just exist in humans, but that it stays in our places, that it seeps into our streets and our fields and our houses and our landscapes and our seascapes, and leaves a resonance behind, leaves atmospheres behind. And usually as a writer, I'm responding to some sort of feeling that a place gives out. It's always a place is the first spark for me. With a story, something in the atmosphere of a place that I'm passing through, or even that I know well, will make me want to create a story set there. There was some review in the US that described the book very positively, but it described it as heartbroken people up in the hills, and it kind of covers it.
There's such a vivid sense of place. I think, in a way, one could almost call it a sort of Dubliners for a rural environment, and I say that not. I think what you're doing is like what Joyce was doing with Dublin, where he sort of puts it on the map. What you're doing is essentially providing a kind of anatomy of life in these areas, and you're using some of the interestingly similar techniques, I find, linguistically. You mentioned the whitethorn. I was so glad you brought it up, because the word appears in deer season, it appears in old stock, it appears in Extremadura, and it appears in that old country music. And I started hearing almost a sort of Homeric epithet in that. Joyce very deliberately would repeat certain words in Dubliners. Right? He talks very explicitly about wanting to let certain words radiate throughout the various works. And it feels like what you're doing in these stories is connecting them to each other in some of the lovely ways that he does that in that book, where there are echoes, but they're not one-to-one correspondences. The death at the end of one story might be echoed at the beginning of the next, but it's not the same body. Is that something that you were consciously aware of?
Well, you know what? The biggest fun for me in terms of putting a story collection together is sequencing. Is arranging the order that the stories come in. And I think a lot about music. I think a lot about favorite records, favorite albums, and so forth, and the way they flow. So I'll be thinking about like Marvin Gaye, what's going on, the way he structures that record. But it's what was I as I was saying earlier, it was 9 years since my last collection. So I gathered every story that I had in a more or less finished condition since then, and there was about 20 of them that were kind of finished to some degree, and I picked 11 that seemed to talk to each other, that seemed to cohere in kind of odd little slant kind of ways, and that often it was geographic. Most of the stories are within a small sort of a 3-county area around where I live now in the rural northwest of Ireland, And what you find over a period of 8 or 9 years as a story writer is concerns repeat. Your approaches to each story are different, but the same stuff comes up again and again. And it's really fun to sequence a book just to come at the same kind of the same subjects in different ways and in slant ways. But you know, and I think we all have these kind of cluster of words that we hit on again and again as writers that bring the work into a cohesive way. There's a lot of hauntedness in my texts. There's a lot of melancholy. These words come up again and again. Wounds, you know, there are many wounds. It's weird. I'm actually quite a cheerful, happy person, and people reading these stories mightn't come away with that. But it's what I love about the story collection as a form is it's a really good record of the way you've been changing as a writer, because it's not like a novel where you sit down and write it in a particular frame, a shorter time frame. You might write a novel over a year or two or longer, but mine tend to be shorter periods. But a story collection is spread out over a decade or more, and it's a really nice record of the way you've been sort of moving as a writer, your course, you know.
But that structure that you were talking about, the I suppose alternation of the voices of the stories, of the way they interconnect, perhaps the connective tissue that runs between them. I noticed you've got a few third-person stories at the beginning. You move into the first person in the middle of the book, the fourth through the fifth, through the sixth or seventh stories. You go back to the third, back to the first, and then back to the third, and then the last story is sort of third and first, the Retke and the Bughouse. To me, it feels like it really ties together this alternation between the third and the first that you're doing throughout. Was it deliberate in sort of heading towards a mixture of the two?
What I love about writing a short story is if you get the voice wrong at the start, if you get if you know. It's not like you've spent 2 years getting the voice of a novel wrong, and it's a lot of work to go back and change. But you can correct yourself quite quickly. And I'll very often start a story in the first person, and inside half a page I go, no, this is third, or vice versa, you know. But you're absolutely right in that closing story. Retke, it blends. It goes from one into the other, and I wrote that story literally a few days after I finished my novel Beetlebone, which was about John Lennon coming to this part of the world where he owned an island off the west coast of Ireland. And I wrote that novel in a kind of a weird mix between first and third as well. And that carried over into doing this story about Theodore Retke, which comes out of a kind of a tragicomic real life event in the early 1960s when Retke visited an island called Inishbofin off the west coast here. He had a fairly intense kind of breakdown while he was on, as he suffered many times in his life while he was on the island. Like, he went nuts out there to the point it's a small island where the locals had to host a community meeting and decide, we got to get this guy off the island. And he was committed back to the hospital in the mental hospital on the mainland. And I wrote I might read a couple of lines from that story, Matt.
I was going to ask you if you wouldn't mind doing that. I was looking at some myself, so please go right ahead.
I'll just read from the first page. It's sometimes you get a lucky one as a story writer, and you get a story down in the course of a couple of days, and it doesn't really take much more than the first draft or two. And I love this story because it was like that for me. It's called Retke in the Bughouse. So I'll just read half a page.
Please, yeah.
The limbs of a dead whitethorn appear in the dark to say that the night dissolves. The large, dishevelled man fills the hospital window with a spidery grin as the last of the dark gives out to grey morning. The morning comes up after a night such as this, and you feel like you've fought a fucking war. Now come the slate roofs and the chimney pots and all the weary rest of it, bellowing as slow as greyly waking. He turns to the slight man sat neatly in a bedside chair with palms rested on cheerful knees. What did you say your name was, doctor? I didn't. I'm O'Reilly. Oh, I'd believe it. The doctor has spatters of mud or cow shit on the hems of his trousers, equine snout, tiny head. He half rises from the chair and turns it to face the thin new light in the window and sits again. And how should I address you, Mr.? It's Retka. But you can call me Ted.
Beautiful.
I'm a nightly reader of poetry. I think it's very important for prose writers to keep in touch with what our cousin poets are up to. I think it's also good for your brain to continue to try and learn poems off by heart. As you get into a slightly more mature phase in your life, it seems to do something really valuable. But I'm very often actually drawn to kind of back to my favorite collections. That I like a lot of American mid-century stuff, like Elizabeth Bishop, Robert Lowell. But Retka, I've always been moved by Retka's work when I've come across it in anthologies. Like he was like a car crash of a human being, an absolute disaster zone, but like a just beautiful, delicate, poetic line in contrariness to that. And it was nice to get a story for him that felt like it was working out. I had vowed when I finished the Beetlebone novel 3 days before writing this, I said to myself, like I took myself aside and gave myself a stiff talking to. I said, never again am I putting a real person in a fictional story. It's too much responsibility. And I was at it inside 3 days.
Did you at all have in mind Carver's wonderful Errand? There's a wonderful story that he writes about Chekhov's last days. Yes. Yeah. It struck me as in a sort of similar spiritual vein, I think.
And there's also certainly that must have been somewhere. I think that's somewhere in the DNA of the story for sure. There's also another story inspired by Chekhov in a story by the great Irish writer John McGahern. I think it's called Oranges. It's the last story in one of McGahern's great collections from the 1970s, and yeah, it's often a kind of a writers writing about writers. I don't do it very often, but it kind of in some ways feels an outlier in this collection, but in some way also it seems to synthesize voices the way that I use them and the way that I try to bring them together. Like my third person approach to a story is very often very close third. You're really kind of in behind the kind of the eyebrows.
The free and direct style, essentially.
Yeah.
Wonderfully, in this story, you have what sometimes breaks down into almost pure language. When you're in Retka's head, and he's suffering in the course of the story, right? I think we see a person in extremis, and there are sections, a few sentences on page 185 come to mind. Creamy mustache, peat smoke, poem, too easy, Ted. Fucking teat complex. Now ambition in the heavy morning jangles of single manic chord. He considers suavely the needle-thin doctor. There's something about the concatenation of those sentences that each of them is sensible, each of them is intelligible, but put together, there's a sort of pressure on a narrative there where it doesn't add up. And I think that's beautifully capturing what's happening in his mind.
It's like that thing I was saying about music, about prose fiction as a musical form. And sometimes when you get that magical flow coming in a story, one line just automatically gives you the next line as you go across. I'll just read a little paragraph from it to kind of that really kind of shows the way that works for me sometimes. If it's a lucky day, he is priapic, he is humid, he is ambitious. If there was no ambition, he would not write at all. When it is so insistent, so flagrant, so grabby, it poisons every word that he writes. He can see the words queering on the page, and he sweats in the night. And even as he drinks, and even as he makes love, what he thinks is this: maybe I can make my own mythology still. Maybe it is ambition that can trace my name across the skies and years, and you will commemorate me then with greened brass plaques in bars and on piers. Theodore Retka had a crack up here.
Wow.
So yeah, it's kind of a song that it becomes, I think. And it is a weird feeling to have a real life person in your book, and not from the historical past, really, from the 1960s. So I think his wife, who's mentioned in the book, is still alive, Beatrice. Mm-hmm. So you have this weird kind of paranoia on your shoulders as you write that you're doing it justice, and so there's kind of added pressure. But it was just lucky sometimes with a story when they come very quickly inside of a few days. That's the great attraction of the form. compared to writing scripts or novels, which, it's a long, slow slog, but you can be lucky with a story and inside 2 or 3 days have a finished thing on your desk that you're happy with.
Didn't Kafka write the Judgment in one night? I believe that's the apocryphal story, anyway, that he managed to get the Judgment written in one night.
Apparently, Joyce wrote The Dead quite quickly. But like at the age of 22, Joyce wrote The Dead when he was 22, which is just which is just criminal, really.
But the flip side of that is that Ulysses, I think, began as one of the stories in Dubliners, and then it splintered off into its own book. So that's perhaps the metastasizing reverse.
It's funny to talk about things like Dubliners, to talk about there people ask about the great tradition in Irish literature and Irish writing. And actually, there are many different traditions within it. I think Irish writers in the second half of the 20th century struggled a lot with the fact of these two huge contrary influences of Joyce and Beckett, who had, polar opposite approaches to prose form. With Joyce putting everything onto the page and Beckett taking everything off the page. And Irish writers in the second half of the 20th century struggled with these two kind of approaches and to find a balance between them. I really like the kind of more mischievous streak that goes back to Irish writing, through writers like Flann O'Brien, and that goes back to Lawrence Sterne in the 1700s, which is a kind of a roguish, kind of a fun stream where writers are kind of making fun of the forms and kind of having a kind of a mischievous kind of approach to it, and
more conscious of form, right? I mean, certainly more aware of form as content. Perhaps. Yeah,
it's really interesting to read someone like Flann O'Brien, now stuff he was writing in the 30s and 40s, like at Swim Two Birds. He was one of those historically unlucky writers that Swim Two Birds came out the day the Second World War started, or something like that, and it was just disaster. But it reads really freshly. It's metafictional. It could have been written, last week, and he's a writer whose reputation, while it was submerged for years, continues to kind of come true.
Mm-hmm. If I can shift gears for just a moment, you have in Ox Mountain Death Song, you have a story that is, in a sense, of a different piece from some of the others, and to me feels like a Cormac McCarthy-like story in the middle of the book, which I found just absolutely fascinating. How easy it seemed to be for you to evoke the spirit of that kind of menace.
It's a kind of
that.
It's the oldest story in the book. I think written in 2012, and I was very involved in my writing practice at that stage with kind of bringing genre and literary fiction together in a kind of a mashup. So this story is a kind of a Western. Essentially, it's like you have a policeman figure, so you have a sheriff and an outlaw, and there's even a ripe widow in there, totally shamelessly, bringing all those Western tropes in. So I think after my first novel, City of Bohan, my first published novel, not the first novel I tried by any means, but that was a real mashup of genres and styles, of high and low, of taking real pulpy forms, like the gangland, like thriller, but then writing it in a really a language that was really striving for the high style, for effect, and seeing what results when these kind of worlds collide. And the story is kind of coming out of that, I think, where it is this kind of a Western setup. And it was one of the first stories that I wrote set in the Northwest around here. I'm not a native of here. I come from a city, Limerick, much further south. So it takes a while for your immediate surrounds and vicinity to infect your work, and this was the first one that worked out for me. So it got some. It's kind of, in places here, it's quite a mythic landscape. It looks like a little Western landscape compressed. So it's a kind of an Irish Western.
It's a real triumph. I think it's a beautiful story, and I think you do so wonderfully. In capturing a sense of these characters' interconnectedness, even when not everyone in the relationship is aware of that interconnectedness. There's a kind of Javert-like fixation, and we get to watch one character be utterly preoccupied with another who's doing his best to essentially avoid detection. And there's a little bit of dramatic irony because we know, and he knows much more about about his prey's fate, essentially, than the prey knows the whole story. I don't want to give too much away, but you talk a lot about the death that will happen throughout, and there's this wonderful misdirection that's happening that pays off so beautifully at the end in a surprise, I think. Were you aware of wanting to write toward a twist in that, or was that just a natural consequence of where the story was taking you?
Maybe so. I tried something different with the stories, and I tried to write it on location in the Ox Mountains. I said I'm going to treat this like a short film, and I went out to the mountains on my bicycle. I cycle a lot in the west of Ireland, in what passes for our summer. So I went out for a few days, and I kind of, anytime I cycled out around there, I thought this is a great, like, little mythic Western landscape, great setting for a Western. But I didn't know who the characters were until I pulled into a gas station, petrol station one day, and had an orange juice, got off my bike, and a police car rolled in, and this big fat old cop got out and just kind of straddled across the forecourt. And I said, there's one of them. Who's he after? And it gave me the story quite quick.
Wow.
But it's weird. Like, I never really do research as such for my fiction, but it's amazing the stuff from life that does give you a story years later. And I remember my very first job in the late 1980s. I'm giving away my seniority of my age now, but my first job was as a cub reporter, an old-fashioned cub reporter on a city newspaper in Limerick. And so I used to do, like, the courthouse and the city council meetings and all that kind of stuff. And I remember doing the court meeting one day, and there was this great old detective sergeant, nice guy, a guy called Mick Brown, and he would always have a word with the young reporters in the press box. And he pointed out a guy one day who was up for something quite innocuous, like a 19 or 20-year-old guy up for stealing a car or something like that. And he said to me, see this kid? He'll kill.
Wow.
Okay. And it was just this sense of an old policeman who had this intuitive kind of reading of what a young offender was capable of. I don't know if it happened, if his dark prophecy turned out, but it stayed with his certainty. The air of kind of chill certainty in the way that he said it stayed with me for years, and eventually got a story out of it kind of 20 odd years later.
And I don't want to give the story away, but you do such a great job of turning expectations on their head in this story. The menace in this story, in some ways, is about misapprehension in part, right?
And also, I think it very evidently comes from the kind of the landscape in the story as well. The kind of somber, menacing atmosphere of the story comes very directly out of that. I might read just
I would love it
from it. So this is describing the outlaw figure who's on the run from our sergeant. He knew the bog roads, the copses, the cypress arbours. He knew the recesses of the hills and the Turlock hides. He knew the crannies of the coast. He knew the new-built estates and the spread and bungalow drift of the ever-changing villages and the backways of townlands and the gardens of priests and the old walled domains, just as he knew the lairs of ripe widows and the dampish, sea-blown odour of beachside apartments, and knew the tin-roofed sheds, the outbuildings, the caves. He knew Zion Hill and the Union Wood. He knew the ruts and tunnel of the country of the ox, a post-glaciated terrain, and knew where mountains had moved, the cracks and openings that were made. He knew the country of the ox and the infinite thousands of its hiding places. You may not be wrong there, Matt, about a Cormac McCarthy influence. I think I might have been on one of my very frequent rereads of like Blood Meridian or something.
Well, I'll tell you, on page 56, we have what felt to me like a conscious homage, and I love this line. It starts, a pensioner in an old farmhouse on the Mayo side of the mountain, and you say, picture it forlorn. And I couldn't help but think of See the Child, the famous opening of Meridian, right? See the Child.
Yeah.
It's the only moment of the second person.
He's Cormac McCarthy is a very Irish writer. Obviously, with the name McCarthy.
I know what you mean beyond the name, right? Tell us about what do you mean by
there's Irish heritage there. I often think that writers of rural Ireland have a great deal in common with writers of the American South. and the American West. You face a lot of the same problems on the page, especially in rendering the dialect and the idiom and the way people speak in southern states and in the west of Ireland and rural places. It can seem like you're overdoing it. It can really feel like you're laying it on too thick. But people from the west of Ireland, people from Alabama, they sound like they come from these places. And it's so many of the kind of great kind of Western tropes in storytelling come from Irish and Scottish influence on the southern US states. So when I'm reading Flannery O'Connor or Barry Hannah or reading Faulkner, I feel like first cousins, very much so, and absolutely in Cormac McCarthy as well. I love the really early McCarthy stuff, which is in the South before he actually goes west. Books like Suttree and the very, very haunting Child of God. Which no one ever recovers from after.
No, it's maybe darker than Blood Meridian if possible. Yeah. You do such a wonderful job of capturing the vernacular that you're referring to as, I suppose, essentially local flavor in the language. Just one little tossed off example on the bottom of 5. It's just a word and it's a slight inversion, but it captures, I think it suggests so much of what's great about your ear. You say, catching his breath one Monday morning, he reached in with his phone and took a photograph. And in this way, he had her hours for the week got. And you put the verb at the end there. And there are many more examples like that. I'm sure you can speak to this. Tell us about,
he had her hours for the week got. Only an Irish person would form the sentence in that way. And it's because there's an underlay of another language under the way we use English, which is Irish, which was the first language in the country until kind of 200 years ago. And now it's still spoken commonly in some areas, but mostly it's just something you do at school, So we kind of have pidgin Irish, really. But the way the verbs are used, it's kind of reversed from the form you'd get them in English. And Irish people use that formation still when they speak English. So it's a really kind of bastardized, beautifully mangled version of the English language that we speak here, which turns out to be a really useful resource for a fiction writer because it couldn't come from anywhere else,
Right. I mean, that's what I found myself in reading it in all of those examples, and I won't belabor us with them. There are so many. When you read the book, everyone out there, which everyone should, you'll see what a brilliantly attuned ear Kevin has to these fine distinctions in sentence structure and in everything we're talking about. But it really feels like what you have at your disposal is this sort of infinite resource that you can decide to go high or low, that you can, there's a variety of dictions available to you. There's a variety of syntaxes, and it just must feel like you have this abundance at your disposal. Is that how it feels for you as an Irish writer who happens to also just to be a writer, period?
I think I write kind of play scripts and screenplays a lot now as well. I think the closest related profession to writing is acting. I think we have a lot in common with actors. It's all about those voices in your head, and there is also the same kind of vocational aspect to both trades. We do it because we have to do it. Same for writers as for actors. And I think I often approach a story maybe in the way that an actor approaches a role. I try to get I try to buy into the character. I also. It's a weird thing. Like there's a lot of talk in my book. There's a lot of dialogue, but as well as listening to people and eavesdropping and stealing bits of dialogue. And Ireland is great for that because we say crazy shit all the time. But it's I really like to watch the way people hold themselves in the world, the way they physically display themselves, the amount of kind of affront they're offering in their physical stance. Very often, I'm writing about Irish working class men from the kind of same kind of background I come from myself, and their physical stance is very often kind of defensive, kind of shoulder on, and it's tense, knotted kind of way of holding the person. And in that sort of shoulder on stance, there are like hundreds of years of religion and class and politics and the wrong end of colonial history and all these kinds of things are in that, But if you can picture in your mind's eye the way a character is holding herself or himself in the world, you very quickly get their voice and you get their heart and soul following on from that. So it's something I think about a lot, is how's this character displaying himself or herself in the world.
Well, you do a wonderful job of describing people physically, and you do it with a light touch. You kind of come in and you dip out almost as quickly as you're in. Perhaps you would read on page 32, the top of the page of 32. I just find that one paragraph at the top such a wonderful example of your descriptive powers of people's appearances.
I have a different edition.
Okay, it's in deer season. She saw at near range that he was good looking enough. Maybe it's 4 pages in my edition.
Okay, let me
just the one paragraph that starts, she saw at near range.
Okay, trying to find that.
Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4. It's the 6th paragraph into the story.
Okay, 1, 2, 3. She saw at near range that he was good looking enough, with a long and sharp featured face that was pinched with kindness, and scruffy hair with some grey in its wires, and his eyelashes closed slowly now and opened again, a long exposure to inspect her. Hello, he said.
It's you pick 3 things. They're the 3 perfect things to describe him with, and we need no more and no less. And it just feels like what you do throughout this book is always give us exactly what we need, and never undernourish the physical description and never overstate it. And I wonder if that's a line that you're always finding.
What I love to do is edit. I hate first drafts. They're always horrendous. They always look horrible on the screen or on the page. It's always a mess. They never really improve, no matter how long you're writing. But what I love to, and I tend to write a very long first draft just to give myself stuff to cut. So I love to take away the scaffolding. And the thing then is the fun of it is when you take away a piece of scaffolding and the story is still standing up on the page, and it's still working in that way. So it's what details do you leave? And just it's always, I think, in the short form, in short fiction, less is more with description. And it's how much you can take away, and even when you cut it, it's still there somehow magically submerged.
That Hemingway iceberg idea, right? Yeah. Well, one last thing I'd like to point out, and then I'd like to turn it over to some questions from anybody listening in. You have a wonderful capacity to find the perfect line of dialogue to finish either a section with or even a story with. And in fact, multiple times in the book, the story itself will end on this resonant line of dialogue that suggests so much of the relationship between the interlocutors, opens up onto a new unexplored field that the story won't touch on, but that it hints at, and provides a certain amount of ambiguity even in the line itself. And I wonder, are you heading toward a line of dialogue like that to finish it out? Is that something that you like to do, or is this a consequence of just whatever's natural in any given story?
It's weird when I conceive of a story. Very often, what I have is a kind of a strong sense of the opening, and I very often have a good idea of how it ends, how it concludes. And maybe it's on such a resonant line as you describe. What I don't have, and what's very important for me not to have, is anything of the middle. There has to be that voyage of discovery for me between those 2 points, and the story. I wanted kind of a pool of oily blackness and silence where there's nothing between that first part and the conclusion, because that's the fun for me. I have to be having a good time with the story. There has to be discovery for me. I have to be surprised. The beloved reader at the end of the process won't find herself surprised. But yeah, it's weird. I don't know if it's common, but I very often have that opening and closing set up in my mind. Very often I give away the whole story in the first paragraph as well, just to kind of show that plot isn't my primary interest, to put it like that. So I'll tell the whole story, and then that just lets me get into character, which is what I'm most involved with, and atmosphere and feeling and poignancy that might come through.
Well, it's beautifully achieved, and I think we feel as we're reading this, that discovery that you're making constantly in these stories. It feels as if revelations are happening to us, but within the story itself constantly as we read. So, there's no, I can't think of a book of stories recently that does actually as beautifully capture the feeling of discovering what the very next thing is, that the writer is discovering this and the reader is sharing in that discovery. It's quite beautifully rendered.
Thanks so much, Matt.
So
I'm spotting one, and I'm trying to figure out Chromecast. I can now see questions.
Yeah, I'm looking for them myself. So I'd like to give some time to all of us out there who have questions, but I'm only seeing the chat comments. So how do
is it easier to have an international career while still living a rural life than it might have been 50 years ago? That's a really interesting question. You know what? You make these decisions in your life that seem to have nothing got to do with your creative work, but turn out to kind of dictate it completely. And very often that decision is where you're going to live, where are you going to base yourself. And it's where traditionally for young emerging writers, the thing was you'd go to the city, you'd go to London or New York or Paris and sit in your writer's garret and compose your masterpiece. But of course, pragmatically, economically, that's not possible now. For very often, writers kind of priced out of the cities. So my wife and I moved here to rural County Sligo 13 years ago, and I had no idea that I was going to be writing all these stories set in places like the Ox Mountains, but it's that question. Is it easier now to work from a place like this than it would have been 50 years ago? Inestimably, I think, it's like I complain a lot about the online world and the internet and all of this, but it's been so beneficial in terms of, the way we disseminate our work and the way and get people talking about the work. And it's been even really cool to be able to do these Zoom things during the pandemic. It's for sure there's a little bit of computer fatigue out there with all this, but it's really nice to be able to stay connected to readers and other writers in this way.
Kevin, I'm looking at the questions. I see if you look at the bottom, we have the ask a question.
I see. Yeah.
And, I think you actually directly addressed the question about plot or language. It seems that you, in some ways, anticipated that question and very much said that it's the language and not the plot, right? I think. Yeah.
I would say that I don't kind of by any means dismiss plot. I don't call it that. I call it story. Plot suggests a type of story. I often call it thumb. You want to give the reader just enough that they really have to keep thumbing through those pages, and just enough of a narrative thread pulling them along. It can be as straightforward as, is this romance going to work out, as in the first story, but you have to give some. I don't believe in just like pure language experiments on the page with no narrative pull at all. You need something. Often it's the question for me is how little can I get away with giving here in terms of kind of of plot. But I guess, like I said before, what I'm most interested really is in character.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Take a look, Kevin. There's hello from Tullamore.
Hello from Tullamore. How are you?
He or she is saying, I think he exists in every rural town. Do you think the characters like him will continue to exist, or do they belong to times past? So this is this character you were describing earlier. What do you think here?
This character who's obsessed with debt in all its forms, locally, internationally. So whenever you meet this character McCarthy in the story, his first question is, Did you hear who's dead? This character will forever exist in Ireland. we're an especially morbid, lachrymose race of people. The most popular website in Ireland is called RIP. .ie is our .com, and it's basically county by county the deaths, and that there's a whole sort of age group of Irish people. The first thing they go online every morning is RIP.ie. Who has died in the night? So this character, he's absolutely an archetype. He's an archetypal character, but he does exist in every town we know. We all know this character. This character is in all our WhatsApp groups somewhere as well. For sure.
Jackie asked a tough question, but I think a very interesting one, and perhaps unanswerable, but maybe you can take a 30-second stab at it. What is it about Ireland that causes it to produce great writers?
It's easy. It's the rain. It's one of the things we kind of keep quiet about is the fact that climactically, it's an extraordinarily dreary country about 9.5 months of the year. It rains and it's grey, and there's that murky Atlantic cloud just sits on the place. And these are perfect conditions to make an island of storytellers and fabulists. You know, you have to make stuff up, or you'd go nuts. You have to make up very vivid stories to get through that kind of barrier of Atlantic cloud. But I think, you know, the fact that we're a maritime people, that we sit on the edge of that vast, malevolent ocean, that has a big effect on the character of Ireland. We kind of love to talk. We love the sounds of our own voices. You may have noticed here today, but it's but contrarily to that, very often we say very little. You know, an awful lot of the meaning of an Irish conversation is going along just underneath the surface of the talk, and it's what's not being said. And very often that's where you find your stories.
Do you think, Kevin, do you think there's anything to the idea of a highly educated people who are forced into a peripatetic lifestyle or life because of economics? You know, people who come with a ton of perspective, a ton of education, and maybe the need to leave or the need to look elsewhere, not even if they physically leave, but a sense of an awareness of a kind of larger context. Does that strike you as reasonable, or am I off base with that?
No, not at all. I think it's. I mentioned John McGahern earlier as well, and he said something very interesting, that Irish writers weren't naturally novelists, that we were more naturally short story writers, because Irish society comes out of a kind of a feudal model. And really the stories that were told in everyday life are from very directly from your immediate sort of tribal surrounds and family surrounds and so forth. He said, like, you know, the great novelists come from great societies, from like the Russian society of the kind of 1900s, or from the American society of the 20th century, whereas the story has a particular grasp and pull in Irish life.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Just see, someone has asked me to recite one of my favorite poems. Don't tempt me. We'll be here for the night. If I get onto Jared Manley Hopkins, all bets are off. You know, we can be here for the night. I like so many writers, I had the experience of a particularly beloved English teacher in secondary school, which is high school here. And my teacher, Mr. Lynch, was obsessed with Manley Hopkins and would like beat those poems into us. And I remember getting really into Hopkins and just getting into the rhythm of his line in a poem like "The Wind Hover, I caught this morning, morning's minion, kingdom of daylight's dolphin, dapple, dawn-drawn falcon," in his writing of he's buried in Dublin, by the way. He was a Lancashire man, but he was a priest in Dublin and is buried there. So I've paid homage to his site.
Well, maybe, Kevin, maybe we can ask just to look at one more of these, and then I'll wrap us up here. Or perhaps sure. I might need to do that, actually. I think we're at 1:59. Maybe we should go to Marcia from the festival to come back.
Okay.
Send us off. I apologize, Simon. I wanted to ask your question for you, but maybe we can follow up later with that. Marcia, did you want to say anything?
I just wanted to thank you both for being here with us today. It has been a fascinating and stimulative and formative discussion on the major influences, themes, styles, and genres in your writing. Also, Kevin, your readings transported us all to Ireland. You're such a great actor. What a pleasure. A quick reminder to everyone to please buy the author's books via the green button below and consider donating to Succeed Together. We wish to thank our festival sponsors, event partners, festival friends, volunteers, and festival staff, as well as everyone who has helped us to put on our festival events. We have some more events coming up today and tomorrow. The next event is 2 p.m. New Voices, a talk with our mayor, Aimee Irani, and Ruveni, probably mispronounced that. Vilhauer at 2 p.m. Take a look at our Crowdcast channel to sign up. Thank you to both of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Marcia. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Kevin.